I would like to introduce you to our keynote speaker today, Chandran Nair. So Chandran is the founder of the Pan-Asia think tank Global Institute for Tomorrow, GIFT for short, GIFT. So he's a member of various leading international organizations, such as the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Governance for Sustainability, as well as the Club of Rome, a global platform of diverse thought leaders with members who are past politicians, academics, and business leaders. So Chandran is often invited by leading global business schools as guest lecturer, including INSEAD, Duke, London Business School, and Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. Chandran is very passionate and visionary about topics around environmental sustainability, economics, as well as social development. He's extremely insightful and publishes books as well as articles with the Financial Times and the New York Times, and has been invited onto BBC, Bloomberg, or CNN to share his views. So feel free to check out his LinkedIn profile for more details about Chandran, as well as the articles and his viewpoints. So with that, we would like to invite Chandran to take the stage. Chandran, the floor is yours.
Thank you, AK. And I think all of you will agree that the world has changed just in the short 12 months since I last spoke. And given that I'm speaking to an audience of organizational development, CHROs, and consultants in that wider spectrum of organizational change, etc., I thought I'd just say that as the world has changed, we have particularly seen in the United States and Europe, etc., what I call the great corporate retreat, the retreat from science, the retreat from confronting moral hazards, the retreat from DEI, climate change, and all of those issues. And if you're interested, I wrote a piece about this about 6 months ago for the corporate education institution called Duke University. The question that I asked in terms of getting us to have this discussion is, did all these leaders ever believe in anything? Because as soon as they had an opportunity, and in this instance, particularly given the political pressure of the bully pit of the White House, they retreated with no conviction. One of the thoughts I would like to challenge and perhaps put in front of all of you is whether this is actually a failure of the entire organizational development sector, the human resources sector, that whole business of learning and development, etc., because these very people in organizations that are retreating from what most of us will say as essential needs, all went through and invested supposedly in organizational development. So let me come to the theme of the discussion, the conference today, which is the art of strategic change embedded in courage, conscience, and clarity. And I will speak from my experience, and maybe some of you may have a slightly different experience. But as an independent provider of services and engaging with corporations on a whole range of issues, not just leadership development, but advisory services, etc. And I've said this many times and openly, I found very little courage in large corporations. Conscience, debatable. Clarity in terms of looking at issues that are out there and speaking out with a conscience and with courage, rare. So I think these things are very easy for us all to utter. But my point is that they are rare. My experience is they are being suffocated. And I don't understand why leaders, people in roles where they should be people of change and influence, can't exhibit any amount, little bit of courage, a little bit of conscience, and some clarity. So let me just, then morph into discussing what is change in the current world we live in. I think all of us will accept that in the world we live in, we need change. And I'm referring particularly in this instance to all of us who are involved in the so-called business of change, and not treating it simply as a business, but also as an obligation of our professional callings. And the current context needs change in how organizations see their role in society. What has transpired in the last few years is an acceleration of the issue with regard to how do people see their role in society, starting with the corporation as a whole. So I would like to start by, addressing the world we live in, which is what I've been asked to talk about, the world we live in. And I would try and distill it into, we live in a 3D world. It's not a 3D digital reference, a 3D world made up of denial, steeped. This is, in my view, a charge against all corporations. There's such a deep denial within large organizations about the world we live in, delusion and dysfunctionality. Now, I could use the tech analogy and said we are moving into a 5D world, and to that you could add a deceit and dystopian. And that really is the experience I've seen. And I think we have a huge amount of work to do to reverse what we are seeing. So what strategies or what strategic change do we need in this 3D or 5D world? And what can the organizational development, the CHROs, the consultants who play in this area do to redefine the purpose of the organization? And one of the things I've started to notice is that the public relations exercise, the need to be seen to be aligned with the wider issues of our world, has become essentially something so superficial that slogans have taken over anything of substance and meaning. Everything from net zero, when it comes to the world we live in, everything with regards to how we treat other people's inclusion, all of these have become slogans too. And I wonder, where have the organizational development consultants, experts, and the in-house people been? My conclusion is, and I'll come to this later, perhaps in the in the questions, they've essentially become handmaidens of the executives. So what is the world we live in? And this is a much larger topic, but a snapshot, at least from where I live, and I think most of us should know. I was in Singapore just yesterday for 2 days, speaking at a World Economic Forum sponsored conference on impact and change. And one of the things I argued is that the mainstreaming of narratives that are in denial of the world we live in is the first thing we need to tackle. So what is the world we live in? Just to give you a short sort of review of what that looks like, everyone's aware that we lived in a world where conflicts are increasing, where even a genocide is being committed and we are helpless. But the most powerful nations in the world are in denial about a genocide. Second, a world in which we see climate change, catastrophic collapse of ecosystems. And I could go on, land degradation, biodiversity loss, rising inequality, the pollution of the oceans, water scarcity, and very importantly, social disruptions that are breaking old traditions that were fashioned over hundreds of years, that are falling as modernity essentially assaults old traditions and cultures. And I will add to that the very important issue that is not addressed enough in large organizations, but because it is a must-have, which is the overreach of technology, and I mean digital technology. So we live in a world in which hard questions about what are we doing are rarely asked. And if I can, without being unfair, challenge your professions, the people who are in organizational development, where have you all been? Why aren't you questioning this? My simple understanding as a non-organizational development professional is that organizational development in its shortest form is it's about understanding all the people-related forces having a bearing on the organization, and then harnessing all of those to achieve the organization's goals. But within there lies some very profound questions, given the world we live in. What are those organizations' goals? And in that context, I see that the organizational development sector professionals have a very important role. They are, in my view, and I hope you don't see me as naive or oversimplistic, they need to be the custodians of the purpose of the organization. They need to be the people asking the hard questions, after all. They should be the conscience of the company. After all, if we leave it to the finance director, he or she is programmed, hardwired, typically, even if they are good people, to look at the short term because markets rule. And I've been doing a piece of advisory work for a very large bank, and I spoke to the finance director. He said, we are trapped. We are trapped in the tyranny of short-term needs. We know it's wrong, but we're trapped. But then we are seduced by perverse incentives. And again, I think where the organizational development people who should be the front line are realigning these ridiculous KPI short-term things that people with conscience know are wrong, but do not feel they have a voice. And these are at the top of the organization. So like lemmings, everyone's following. And this is why I come back to my point that the organizational development professional, the CHROs, etc., should be the people who are the conscience and the custodians of the purpose. They should be the front line to create a new organization in the context. They should be extremely aware of what's going on in the world and not pretend that they are separate from the rest of the world. So coming back to this notion of the world we live in, I think I don't need to do a 2-hour presentation, which I typically do, about the existential threats facing our world. Now, these existential threats need to be understood too. These existential threats have been brought to the attention of humanity through the sciences. So when I was speaking to a crowd of 300 people in Singapore, all about investing in climate and all the mumbo jumbo about carbon net zero and carbon neutral, all the slogans that I just referred to, I asked people who were scientists to raise their hands. There were a handful, as always, because every problem needs a solution, and that solution must make us more money. So you don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand the perverse nature of this sort of thinking that suggests that every problem that money created can be solved by solutions that create more money for the same people who created it. And then there is all that malarkey about philanthropy, the laundering of ill-gotten gains to create celebrity, to apparently solve existential threats. So I'm always of the view that the organization exists apparently to make the world a better place, produce goods and services that would serve humanity's needs, not as some spiritual and moral outcome, but as a responsible professional and commercial entity. But today, if we look at the science, it tells us the existential threats we face, be it land degradation through over-industrialization of the agricultural processes, be it the scourge of plastics, to the extent that you and I are now consuming microplastics in ways that we don't even know and we can't even avoid, to the extent that it's actually crossed the bloodline and is in our brains and is found in the reproductive tracts of parents and in even newborn babies. What have we done? Now, these microplastics are not in the environment. I'm just using it as an example because of some mysterious phenomena. These microplastics are in the environment because of the free ride that the chemical industry and all the other subsidiaries that create plastics have created. Marketing geniuses who thought that we should now start putting shampoos, 5 millimeters of shampoos in little plastic sachets that can be sold to people in the so-called developing world who didn't need shampoos in the first place. So these are all created by companies, and I could go through a whole range of things. But the denial that the business models created these traumas, I call them the traumas, these threats, are all a product of the global economy. But do organizations even think about this? I can understand, though not condone, that many of the professionals who are in the business of building the business don't even think about it. But in the era of these threats, which are scientifically based, we need organizational development people, CHROs, learning and development people, to play their role, call this out, call out the science, remind everybody of where we are. Because we have a generational opportunity to redesign our societies now, redesign the way we organize and manage our socioeconomic activities so that everyone can prosper. This is not something that happens in the world outside, because the producers, the catalysts of all these existential threats are the companies we work in. It doesn't make our companies bad, but it does make us negligent if we don't bring it to the attention. Innovate in public policy and private enterprise to create new socioeconomic paradigms. But what it needs is purpose-driven professionals in the 21st century. That's what I kind of do. But what I'm always staggered by is how poorly informed, and I hope you'll not see it as me being harsh or insulting, how poorly informed people in the OD, HR, the learning and development sectors are. And this is a tragedy. They need to be really informed. And so our greatest challenges as human societies now depend on us reversing the assault on natural systems. That assault and that call is not a call for environmentalism. It's a call for a new paradigm of consciousness, which then changes the nature of our economics and our business models. And that needs to start within. So I know that Helen, and if Helen doesn't mind, I'll use the phrase that she shared with me when we were talking about this, because I've been doing sessions on the world we live in. And she told me that one of the things we need to remind people is that the world we live in, which most of us know, which, as I said, is in crisis, is very different from the world we live in. So if you work for a large multinational organization or you're advising them, the moment you walk into those offices, we live in a very privileged place. But then we subject ourselves to the tyranny of denial, the tyranny of hierarchies and all of that, and don't call out what we know is happening outside. Because what is happening outside is the decisions we make in the world we work in. If you work from a pharmaceutical company, you know, you should be questioning those things. If you work for an oil and gas company, you know, you should be questioning those things. If you work for a food and agricultural company, you know, and it's your job to know because you're the organizational development person. And I would, in fact, argue that the organizational development acronym should be changed to, not the acronym, but that term should be changed to organizational purpose and development, the OPD. Because you don't develop an organization in some abstract concept, but you develop an organization based on what its purpose is. And the organizational development people of today should start to define what that purpose is. So I would like to, just end there with those remarks, but also say that we also need in organizational development and the psychology, etc., are rooted and grew out of Western psychology. I would urge that the whole sphere of learning and NTL, etc., start to embrace other philosophies and schools of thought with regard to how we view the world and what we should be doing. There is a whole body of work that some people are involved in trying to do that, so that we start actually acknowledging that systems thinking and critical thinking is essential and embedded in the way we think about our organizations. And I've argued that to redesign the world we live in, we need organizations to change. For organizations to change, we need organizational development people who understand purpose, who are bold, courageous, and speak with clarity, and are willing to stand up for what their professional obligations actually require, and also unlearn what they have learned, and not simply see themselves as professionals who earn a living, because the world we live in is in grave difficulty and trouble, and those difficulties are being caused by the places we work in and the organizations we work for. So let me stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chandran. That was really amazing. It was evocative and provocative and has me thinking already, and it's early morning here. So we're going to take a Q&A. Iki, thank you.
Yeah, I can start us off with a question. So Chandran, there's always been a tension between being in the core and being in the margins. There are pros and cons to each. So being in the core means that perhaps your so-called narrative or initiatives are more directly together with other things like profitability, technology advancement, and all that. But at the same time, it gets watered down. It gets filtered sometimes, and it becomes a KPI in your word, right? Being in the margins means that sometimes it's difficult to get the voices in. But at the same time, being in the margin means that we are able to see more clearly, and we are able to perhaps create more of a ruckus because we are not corrupted by the core. How would you see, which is the better approach? Should we aim for getting into the core organizations, or should we stay at the margins and be the renegade, be the rebel?
Oh, I think it depends on who you are and what role you're playing. But I think, when Helen said we've been pushed aside, I would humbly argue it's because you've allowed yourself to be pushed aside. Too many people are just comfortable with getting that paycheck. And I think, as much as I'm not suggesting that all of us don't have financial, needs, and we all need those jobs, but I think leadership requires the OD profession, HR people, to be a lot more creative if you believe that these things are important, and create a new niche in terms of how you think and push yourself in. So whether you're at this stage in the margins or in the core, you got to play a very important role. But very often you are where you in the margins, perhaps because you haven't sought to be in the core. And then if you are in the core, when you are and remain silent, it's because you are, the harsh way to say it is you don't care. The kinder way to say is you're ignorant and you haven't actually connected the dots and you don't see your power. So I'm of the view that many people seek the easy way out, and high rewards in large corporations are usually the price for your silence. And I think we all need to, as much as we all need jobs and we want to be rewarded, we should not be rewarded on the basis that we scrub and diminish our conscience and the purpose of our professional lives, and seek to do more. And that requires us to be bold but smart about it. So I think there are many ways, and I would just say too many people have copped out because it's the easy way and have not actually stagnated. I know many HR and OD people, they have been doing the same old thing for 20 years and they have not progressed intellectually or anything and not changed their organizations. So I would say wherever you are, you have to push the boundaries. But if you find yourself marginalized, it might be because of you not wanting to challenge and not being smart enough to find narratives and the boldness to make those narratives convincing. I would also argue that I think you'd be surprised if you push that there is actually, because many of the leaders of companies are lost and they might just be waiting for someone to say, how about this? But the ignorance is, and I use that word carefully because it is harsh, about how to connect all of these issues is widespread.
Thank you. Michael Suzuki, please.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks, Chandran. I hear you loud and clear on the challenge that you're putting to us and to me as an OD professional. And I would have to, I think, raise my hand as guilty, being a handmaiden to the status quo in many cases. And at the same time, I am listening to you speak here today. I am reminded of Herb Shepard's first law, which many of us will be familiar with, which is just survive. Right. And so there is, and I hear you in what you've just said as well. I think you've really addressed some of what my curiosity is about, walking that line, right, between being bold and courageous and provocative, and then as against being rejected by the system because we're too bold, too courageous, and too provocative. And, you know, one of the questions I wrestle with regularly, particularly over these last 6 or 8 months, is can I be okay with just making small changes? About being really clear where my ability to influence lies. You know, I'm not getting called by the White House. You know, number 10 Downing Street is not calling me or sending me emails. So, you know, where is my capacity and opportunity to make some of these dramatic changes? And can I be satisfied with the limited sphere of influence that I have? And I have to answer that question, yes. Because if I'm not, why do I get out of bed in the morning?
Yeah. So, Michael, I think this is important, and we do a thing about purpose and the different stages of our lives in terms of where our purpose is found and how we can exercise our purpose depending on where we are. But let me just say, you know, this saying you talked about, just survive. Well, most of us, and I see in this room, are well beyond just surviving. So it depends what you mean. Surviving is the people that in Nepal, in the, you know, in most people in the world just eking out a living. That's the survival. But those of us who are professionals like this, we are well beyond just surviving. So we have, in my view, a privilege. And with that privilege comes a great opportunity and a responsibility to do something. So I would say, when I'm rather annoyed with professionals who have 30 years of experience who give me lame excuses, I say, why on earth would you at 55 take so much BS? You know better. So then the question is, are you intellectually agile enough to want to relearn and then bring change to your organization? And I absolutely agree. We don't get called to the White House. Who cares? But the change is small changes, and then you have to decide which small change do I want to make. But again, without sounding, you know, too cynical, most professionals in the OD and don't even think about these things and just you know, turn the wheel, get another program going, and keep within the framework. So I think small changes are very important, and I don't need to tell you, big changes usually start with small things. So please keep with the small things first, but bring it home and bring it and make it real. And that's how change does happen. And I've seen a couple of people start with something very small, and then it caught the attention of a regional head and then the CEO, and then it blew into something very big. We changed the way the organization looked at its sense of purpose, and it had dramatic effects across the board over years.
Thank you. Becca?
Thank you. Thank you for this. As I listened to you speak, I could feel sort of my heart pounding and like a deep grief in my body, just thinking about the state of the world and what that means for my 11-year-old child. And it got me thinking about how much emotion is part of this. I have a colleague who says, if we want to make change, we have to tend to the animal body first, that piece of us as humans. And so I was just wondering if you might reflect a bit on what you've seen that has been successful to help us not only have the intellectual rigor necessary for this, but the emotional and embodied rigor that we need to make the change.
A good point, Beck, and I'll keep this short. But I've always been accused of being too provocative, and my response to that is we live in a world where the truth is provocative. Secondly, of being angry and pessimistic. And when people tell me I'm angry, I usually say to them, "Why aren't you angry? What's wrong with you?" But I then want to channel my anger to something very constructive. So I always say that my positivity arises from experiencing my emotions and my anger. And many people have essentially almost allowed themselves to atrophy those emotions of outrage at what's happening because it's too difficult to live with. So you have to live with demons in a way. But then have a good time at the same time by being positive, by knowing that the only way to be positive is to confront those demons and be outraged at what's happening and then do something about it. But that's been the mechanism I've used to action and not follow the mainstream and allow myself to be depressed. So that is the emotional side is very important. You have to feel outrage, and then you have to then channel that outrage with action, and it starts perhaps just with small steps.
Thank you, Chandran. Tim Nolan and then Uma.
Yes, I'm finding this highly provocative and challenging, and also calling upon us to modify our approach. Across my long career, I have trained 3,100 OD consultants, and the vast majority don't engage with business reality. It feels like that over there, it's kind of like I could run a McDonald's better, but nobody really pays attention to it. And I think we have to start with engaging with what the organization is truly about. And we have to make interventions that are intellectually confrontational, but not visibly confrontational, because the current leaders know best how to deal with somebody who is acting out. I mean, termination is the answer. So if we can keep people focused on how do I keep my paycheck coming in, then you're owned at that point. I mean, you have to do the gestalt of what's the worst that could happen. You have to be prepared to walk in order to be able to be prepared to talk. And I could go on and on, but one last piece I would say in this very limited time is we need to have and also interventions. We need to look at how do we do this in a way that fosters profitability, fosters our visibility in the marketplace, specifically impresses the investors that this is the right organization to buy stock in, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to push us to be a lot more innovative than many of us in the field are. So, thank you.
Thank you, Tim. There's a lot that you said there that is absolutely spot on. I would go back and just say there's one thing that I talk about that we have to get professionals who understand, as you say, to be organizational savvy because we're not no way does one want someone to get fired, but I think we live in fear too much. And if you're 45 and you've got 25 years of experience, why do you want to be pushed around? I will not be pushed around, but I'm not looking to fight my organization. I'm looking to help it. And that requires intellectual rigor, retraining myself, but also requires me to be a lot more strategic, which is what you're talking about today. How do I strategically take difficult conversations into the core of the business and get people to think differently? And I can talk a lot more later, Tim, if you want, about this idea that also we need to understand that profit is a social contract. And with profit comes costs and externalities. This is an economic argument. And profit is not a right because it has consequences. And so, but that's a larger economic discussion we can have. These are important discussions to be part of the future of how we develop organizations.
Thank you, Chandran. Uma, and then Claire will be the last question.
So, Chandan, I couldn't agree with you more on just about everything that you have said. And I found myself saying these things 35 years back when I was in corporate world for 11 years. And up to a point, I was living it. And I truly say that HR people don't have the courage, don't have the clarity, don't have the competence also to really work on what they're really meant for, HR and OD people. However, it worked up to a point, and it also makes you get perceived as a very powerful person in the system. If you're able to, from an OD role, influence the chief executive, and it has its consequences. So it worked up to a point, and then when the chief executive changed, I was compelled to leave the organization. So I realize, and that's my version of it, that the qualities that we are asking for a person to be this, is almost like omniscient, omnipotent, and like a god, and which we are not. And I took the choice of leaving the corporate world. But many other people I have heard have the same experience, particularly women. You have anything to say to that? Or what you call smart, how much smart a person can be? To me, it sounds like a person being everything, and we are not everything. What's that missing thread in this whole thing, which a OD person would need to survive, whether as internal consultant or external consultant?
Well, I think the first thing is a very good, and you're very experienced at this. I mean, the first thing is we talk about upskilling and all of that, but OD and HR people need to upskill and not be, as you say, this is not rocket science. This is just making some critical connections. So I think the whole industry needs to put people through some training courses that bring some of what I've discussed and others to connect. That you work for an organization, your title is organizational development. Development to do what? These are fundamental, simple, logical questions. I mean, are we willing to organizationally develop and put aside our professional understanding of the externalities related to a certain organizational behavior, product, or service? So I think OD people and HR people, and I don't want to generalize too much, but I've been surprised at how little they have given thought to these issues. So I think upskill, begin to understand the world we live in and start connecting. So if you work for a pharmaceutical company, understand the impacts of the pharmaceutical company on the world and how it works, and start to then discuss it. So the other point I would make simply is that you don't need to be everything, but you can be intellectually bold, get your stuff together, and then very importantly, be smart and start to influence. No one's asking you to be a rebel, but just be intellectually bold. And then upskilling is communication, getting new narratives, being more strategic. You need an element of boldness, but that all of us have different things. But you have to believe in something. And I dare say that I've found very few who really believe in a higher sort of attachment to the purpose rather than, oh, I love to, learn, train people, and they send them to, those awful training courses. So my view, it's not rocket science, but up your game in terms of understanding the role of the organization with regard to the external world. First, make that connection. And after that, say, which is the pain point here that I can see clearly is an issue we have to confront. And then bring your influence to bear in a smart way. Don't get fired.
Thank you, Claire, and then we'll close. Claire, you're muted. Claire, you're on mute. Claire. Claire, you're muted.
Yeah, I want to focus on organizations that have a value of social justice and a lot of OD professionals and also have a need to survive. And in particular, one organization, of course, is NTL. Those of us here. What can we do to not be a handmaiden and to be a custodian and still survive when we have issues of promoting DEI, for instance? How can we, what do we gain by abandoning that and focusing on what the current situation is asking us, or holding to our value, and how might we attract different populations in that? In other words, how can we live our value of social justice and survive?
So Claire, I'm at the moment, interestingly, you talk about DEI. I'm at the moment in discussions with a large DEI organization of lots of companies in the United States who feel that many of these issues are being sidelined and all of that. And I think, again, it's being strategic and being smart. I've asked them to drop the word DEI and start talking about things in a very different way. And actually to start I mean, one of the reasons I think the whole DEI narrative has gone in at least in some places is the narrative has been developed by HR people. It's all the same, and it's become a bit stale, and it's not moved with time. So it's a bit like the environmental movement and the sustainability movement where I come from. I don't use any of those language those people use because it has become stale. So we have to find different narratives and different approaches to deal with those issues. And I'm discussing this, and I'm happy to share that with you some other time, how to change the narratives. And that's what I mean by strategic approaches to the issues and critical thinking, because you have to know how to play the game. And that's being aware, astute, nimble, street smart. I think it's called organizational savvy. So this requires a lot more discussions, and I hope, this organization will organize those kinds of seminars, bring together 20 professionals or 30 professionals and say, listen, how do we move away from all of that DEI stuff? And how do we change the narrative? How do we change the narrative about, race, and even in my country? How do we do that? And that requires, firstly, boldness. And I can say in my own country, where I come from, Malaysia, there's institutional racism. And I'm confronting it all the time. And I see shifts. But I've been very bold in confronting it at the highest levels and writing about it. So it requires strategic thinking and tactics.